There is so much confusion going around about what to do against Vanquished Soul, so today I'm going to teach you how to beat it. What's potion? You got Matt here, and welcome back to another competitive Yu-Gi-Oh video. A few days ago I asked you what deck did you want a how to beat guide for next, and the community came together and said we want Vanquished Soul. Now, I'll be honest, I'm surprised that Vanquished Soul won, but if you guys are looking to play competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! And you don't know how to beat Vanquished Soul, then you're going to want to stick around. Because in this video, I'll show you the best cards to play against Vanquished Soul, when to use those cards, the choke points and weaknesses of the deck, and what decks are best suited to beat it. So if you're excited for the video and for the how to beat series, then make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 100 likes, and I'll bring you more how to beat guides right away. Also, if you guys like deck profiles, combo guides, meta discussions, and competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Videos just like this one, you're going to love this channel. So make sure to subscribe and help future end of year goal of 4,000 subscribers. Now, with that being said, here's the ultimate guide on how to beat Vanquished Soul in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Let's jump into it. So the first thing you have to do when talking about Vanquished Soul is talk about what the deck actually wants to do. But before we do that, this is what the deck really looks like right now in the format today. The ratios for the Vanquished Soul cards are pretty set in stone. There's not a lot of flexibility outside of the non-engine, but the non-engine in this deck specifically is more important than other decks because of the requirements for different attributes in the strategy. Every full power Vanquished Soul deck should have 3 copies of Raisin, 3 copies of Mad Love, 2 to 3 Heavy Borgers, as well as 1 to 2 Caesar Valius, 1 to 2 Jiaolong, usually 2 of them you're going to see, 1 Pantera, 3 Stake Your Soul, 3 Pot of Prosperity, and 1 reinforcement of the army. It's also incredibly common to see 1 copy each of the good Vanquished Soul spell traps, so that's going to be Continue, Dust Devil, and Snow Devil. There's only 1 mandatory card to play in the extra deck, and that's going to be Rock of the Vanquisher, of which 3 are needed. If you're counting along, that's about 24 to 27 cards for the engine and consistency pieces. The rest of the deck is made up of additional consistency pieces, but more importantly, non-engine that's specifically Earth, Dark, and Fire attributes to trigger the powerful effects of the versus monsters. Other cards that see a lot of play in most Vanquished Soul builds are going to be Ash Blossom, Ghost Bell, the Bestials, and DD Crow. They have the 3 attributes that the deck needs to function, and they can be used on both players' turn. In the side deck, there can be only 1, and Ultimate Slayer are almost mandatory. They're so perfect for what the versus strategy tries to do. And because the deck isn't hurt that bad by it, D-Shifter isn't a terrible side deck choice as well. Some builds are incorporating a small Cashier package into the engine as well, the main reason being for power and consistency. 3 copies of Fenrir to search out the 1 copy of Riseheart is very critical because Riseheart just so happens to be a fire monster. This is great for Stake Your Soul, but also good as a bridge for Small World. Now, these cards here are great on their own, but they also can be paired with the Infernoble Arms Durandal to be able to search out Raisin as well, and they don't use your normal summon. So what is the deck trying to actually do? Well, their main game plan is to establish a recurring loop of Heavy Borger and Caesar Valius. These are the 2 big Vanquished Soul monsters, and they can be tagged in and out whenever they really need to. Heavy Borger and Caesar Valius have what's called the tag out effect. The fact that they can target any face of Vanquished Soul on the field, bounce it to hand, and summon themselves out is really solid to be able to avoid targeted effect negation and destruction, which is again an important aspect of what this deck does and why it's so good in the format today. These tag-out effects for Borger and Caesar are critical because the strategy doesn't actually have any negation. It really relies heavily on dodging all the targeted negation and destruction, and it relies heavily on its hand traps for disruption. So now that you know what the deck looks like, what the game plan is, and what the cards do, let's start talking about specific cards and how they interact with the strategy. Starting off with Handtraps, and these are the ones we're going to be covering today. Ash Blossom is an amazing card against the strategy because consistency is the deck's biggest problem. If it can't get to Raisin or have Raisin effectively resolved, then it makes things very difficult for the strategy. So for that reason, Ash is one of the best cards against Vanquished Soul. I personally would rather save Ash for Stake Your Soul if they reveal a fire monster, but if they just normal summon Raisin, you may not have another choice other than just hitting with an Ash Blossom. Droll is an interesting card because the main combo goes through quite a few different adds to hand in their opening turn. It's just pretty low impact unless you specifically hit them with Droll as they add Raisin to their hand, because then they can't add off of Raisin and Mad Love and get the draw off of Borger as well. Personally, I would look at other options before playing Droll, but it's a fine card against the strategy. Imperm and Valor are really bad against the Vanquished Soul engine unless it's exactly one of these 2 scenarios. Firstly, you want to negate the effect of Rock of the Vanquisher, or second, you want to force your opponent to tag out earlier than they would like to. I want to point out that you should never Imperm or Valor a Raisin or Mad Love. If they have Borger or Caesar in hand, they'll just tag out and you'll go -1. Nib is another card that's weird against the strategy. It's just really rare that Nib is actually live against this deck. If they go through non-engine to get to the versus cards, then it will be live, but it's not consistent. A straightforward versus combo will summon usually 3 to 4 times. It'll usually be Raisin, then Rock, then Mad Love or Jiaolong, and then Borger or Caesar. But if they summon Fenrir before that, then yeah, Nib is going to go crazy against Versus. But honestly, whenever I play against Versus, I'll usually be siding out Nib. I wouldn't recommend playing Phantasme. The deck does utilize Link monsters, but it doesn't do much targeting, so I would say that you can find better options. Skullmeister is one of the worst cards to use against Vanquished Soul. None of the cards that they play actually activate in the graveyard, so just don't play Skullmeister. Dimension Shifter is weird because technically it would be solid against Vanquished Soul since they can't recur the resources from the Banish Zone, but they actually side D-Shifter. So it's not a card that will be shutting down or really annoy Versus as much as you would like to. So if your deck already mains Versus, then sure, play it, but if not, I wouldn't bother. I love Bestials, but just not so much in this matchup here. By nature, Versus needs to play darks to be able to use their effects, so they will actually be live, but we already established that Versus doesn't really need their graveyard too much. It's nice if you can hit the Versus that the Rock of the Vanquisher is trying to add back to hand, but just a reminder, Rock doesn't target. Continue does target, so they're actually better against Continue than they are against Rock, but most of the time Continue will target a Raisin which can't be Bestial. Unless Bestials are part of your main engine, they're just below average against this strategy anyways. DD Crow is also below average. It can get rid of the Raisin that the Rock tries to add back to hand, but again, Rock doesn't target, so unless it's the only option, the effect will still resolve. And just like for Bestials, it can shut down Continue since it targets. Ghost Bell is another card that has very few applications against Versus. It can really only hit something like Continue or Rock of the Vanquisher, so I'd rather play other cards. Ghost Ogre seems like it would be good since it destroys the monster, but if Borger or Caesar is in hand, they can actually avoid the destruction. It's another hand trap that I wouldn't recommend playing. Hand traps are decent against Vanquished Soul. Some, like Ash Blossom, are really good, but others most of the time are going to be pretty low impact. So right now, board breakers are the best way to beat Vanquished Soul. These are the ones we're going to be covering today. Starting with Evenly Matched. Vanquished Soul isn't a deck that typically builds a huge board, but because they don't put up any negation, it's actually pretty weak to Evenly. When you attempt to leave the main phase, they can just tag out to whatever they don't need and lose resources that aren't as important as what they want to keep in their hand. Dark Ruler No More is really bad against the deck. Their interruptions are almost always going to be in their hand, and they can just resummon back the Borger or Caesar anyways. I actually really like Kaijus against this deck. A lot of the time, Versus will end on 1, maybe 2 Versus monsters, and if you can Kaiju the only one they have, then they can't tag out unless they summon out another one with Rock of the Vanquisher. Lava Golem will almost always be live against Vanquished Soul, but you need to be playing a deck that can actually afford to play without a normal summon. For those of you that are struggling with Vanquished Soul and you don't need a normal summon, try Lava Golem, it'll work really well. As for Sphere Mode, it's not as good as Lava Golem or Kaijus, because it's rare that Vanquished Soul have 3 monsters on the field that are good enough to warrant being tributed. Change of Heart. It targets, it's not a quick play, so I think you'll understand why it's not a card that's very good against Vanquished Soul. As for Triple Tactics talent, its effect to take is actually quite strong, especially if you play the attributes that get you the bonus effects. And at the worst case, you can draw 2 cards to search for even better board breakers. Talents will almost always be live because of the amount of hand traps that they play. If I'm playing against Vanquished Soul and I have talents in my side deck, it'll be sided in for sure. Kashtira Fenrir is actually a pretty good board breaker against this strategy, unless it's going up against Caesar that reveals an Earth monster. But it is a really good way of getting rid of Rock of the Vanquisher, and because most of the effects that Vanquished Soul has activate during the main phase, you can use the effect of Kashtira to banish without going to your battle phase. Now let's talk about board wipes. Raigeki, Dark Hole, Lightning Storm, and Harpy's Feather Duster. This is it, the cream of the crop. A board wipe like Raigeki, Dark Hole, and Lightning Storm are some of the best cards that you can use against Vanquished Soul. Getting rid of everything is so good. At the best case scenario for the Vanquished Soul player, they have a Caesar or a Raisin that's immune, or they have a set Continue. But these cards are great against Vanquished Soul almost all the time. If your opponent's board is looking something like a Rock of the Vanquisher, Mad Love, and Heavy Borger, then you slapping down Dark Hole will get rid of everything and there's nothing that they can do about it. Unless they have specifically Snow Devil, which will protect them from destruction. Cosmic Cyclone is not the best against Vanquished Soul. The deck doesn't have too many back row cards that are really important to hit. I wouldn't actually play against Vanquished Soul unless you're specifically worried about there can be only one that they usually side deck. There are definitely some cards I missed talking about in this section, but don't worry, I'm going to address them soon. But now what we're going to do is talk about cards that are good going first and going second, starting off with cards that are good specifically when going first. Book of Moon is a great card to use against Vanquished Soul, but I highly recommend that you do not use it during the main phase. But if you do use it during the main phase, then I recommend using it in response to the effect of a tag out from a Vanquished Soul monster in hand. If you book the card that Borger or Caesar targeted, then it actually will prevent it from resolving. Forbidden Droplet is decent because effect negation at quick effect speed is really nice, but more importantly, they can't respond to it under the right circumstances. And then Floodgates like Gozen Match and Rivalry of Warlords. These 2 cards shut down Versus' ability to have multiple monsters on the field. As for cards that are good going second, Book of Moon is still great because you can change the effect to tag out to prevent it from resolving. But even better than that is going to be Book of Eclipse. Book of Eclipse is so good not only because it's able to get everything face down, the fact that it doesn't target is huge, but because it's also able to play around Snow Devil, which prevents from destruction only. And then of course, the board wipes like Raigeki, Dark Hole, and Lightning Storm that I mentioned earlier are fantastic, and I would definitely recommend siding them in against this strategy. As for choke points and weaknesses of the strategy, the first one we're going to talk about is going to be the draw phase, standby phase, battle phase, and end phase. If you can interact with your opponent's monsters during these phases, you're going to be in a really good position to shut down what the Vanquished Soul deck wants to do. If you can get rid of all their Vanquished Soul monsters while they actually can't use the tag out effects, then yeah, you're going to be in a position to really win the game pretty quickly. Non-targeting removal is another great option against this strategy. If you're in a situation with, let's say, Mirror Jade, for example, you try to use its effect to get rid of something like a Borger, and your opponent changes the effect of Caesar Valius in hand to bounce back the Borger, then you can get rid of the Caesar Valius right away before it has a chance to become immune to the activated effects of your cards. And then consistency. The biggest issue with this strategy is finding Raisin. Raisin turns the entire strategy online. While they have a lot of different ways to do that, if you can prevent Raisin from actually happening, then you're going to be in a much better position to win a game against Vanquished Soul than you would be if you let it resolve. Now let's talk about decks that have a good matchup against Vanquished Soul, and the first one we're going to talk about is going to be Unchained. The reason why is because whenever your opponent decides to use the tag out effects of a card, you can chain the effect of Soul of Rage on their turn and the effects of any of the trap cards, for example, to destroy the target and prevent it from resolving. On top of that, the fact that these cards here also get you to DDD Wave Hiking Caesar is a fantastic card against Vanquish Soul. If they decide to go Heavy Borger, it's an effect that would special summon. You can detach, negate it, and destroy it, and they lose the material for quite a while, which is also really impressive against the strategy. Rescue is also really solid against the strategy, even though we've already talked about how targeting is not the best way to interrupt a Vanquish Soul player. The reason why I like Rescue so much is because they can force out so much interaction from a Vanquish Soul player before they actually start resolving their main combo line. And they can also produce some really big boss monsters, and also the back row they have is really solid against what the Vanquish Soul cards try to do. As for decks that have a bad matchup against Vanquish Soul, I personally don't like how Labyrinth interacts with the strategy, and that's for a few reasons. The first is because of the amount of hand traps the deck plays. Since there are so many hand traps in the strategy, you can constantly interrupt the Labyrinth player's consistency, and you can also keep up with card advantage because of Heavy Borger. And finally, if they have a Lady Labyrinth with a trap card set and they activate the trap card to try and get Lady to search for another trap card, if you chain the effect of a Vanquish Soul card in your hand to the trap card activation, they can't actually get the search with Lady Labyrinth, which is really important to what the strategy wants to do. And there you have it. You now know how to beat Vanquish Soul in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Now let me know down in the comments, what deck are you playing this format, and did I miss any ways to beat Vanquish Soul? If you made it this far in the video, you must have enjoyed it even just a little bit, so make sure to smash the like button. If this video hits 100 likes, I'll bring you more guides on how to beat other competitive meta decks right away. Speaking of meta decks, next week the Fire King structure deck gets released, so our coverage of the deck will officially begin. On Tuesday, we're gonna have an overview of the archetype, Thursday will be an amazing deck profile, and Saturday will be the official how to beat guide for Fire Kings. So if you're excited for Fire King week, then consider subscribing to the channel for more amazing competitive Yu-Gi-Oh videos, and of course help us reach our end of year goal of 4,000 subscribers. Thank you all for watching the video, hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.